A white judge confidently sentences a black teen to juvenile prison. Moments later, he discovers a shocking truth about the boy's identity. His reaction changes everything. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment on where you're watching from. Let's get started. Judge Richard Harmon's gavel struck the sound block with practiced precision, the sharp crack silencing the murmurs that rippled through his courtroom. At 58, with salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes that had seen thousands of defendants come and go, Harmon had earned his reputation as the Iron Gavel of Millfield County. Defendants feared him. Attorneys respected him. The local press had once dubbed him Justice's unflinching servant. Today was just another Tuesday on the bench for Judge Harmon, another docket of cases, another parade of faces that would blend into the 15 years of memories since he'd first donned the black robe. "Next case," he announced, his deep voice carrying to the back of the wood-paneled courtroom. The bailiff stepped forward. "Case number 2023 JV 4872, State versus Darius Jackson." Judge Harmon glanced down at the file before him as the defendant was led in. Darius Jackson, 17 years old, charged with breaking and entering, vandalism, and theft under $1,000. The boy stood awkwardly before the bench, lanky in the oversized orange jumpsuit that hung from his narrow shoulders. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his gaze remained fixed on the floor, never meeting the judges. Public Defender Melissa Chen approached the podium. "Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty. We request release to his grandmother's custody pending trial." Harmon skimmed the probation officer's report as Assistant District Attorney Trevor Wells stepped forward. "Your Honor, the state opposes release. Despite the defendant's age, this is his third arrest this year. Previous charges include truancy, shoplifting, and now this more serious break-in at West Side Pharmacy. The defendant has demonstrated an escalating pattern of criminal behavior and disregard for previous court orders." Judge Harmon studied the boy more carefully. Tall for 17, but thin. The kind of thinness that spoke of missed meals rather than athletic discipline. His shoulders curved inward protectively. The judge had seen that posture before, in children who'd learned to make themselves smaller targets. "Mr. Jackson," Harmon said, "do you understand the charges against you?" The boy nodded silently. "Verbal responses in my courtroom, Mr. Jackson." "Yes, sir," came the barely audible reply. "Your previous charges resulted in probation, which you are clearly violating with this new offense. Would you care to explain why I shouldn't remand you to juvenile detention until trial?" The boy's lawyer jumped in. "Your Honor, if I may, I was addressing the defendant, Ms. Chen." Harmon cut her off, his gaze never leaving the teenager. "Well, Mr. Jackson?" Darius shifted his weight, his shackles clinking softly. "I didn't do it, sir." Judge Harmon sighed. In 15 years on the bench, he'd heard that exact phrase thousands of times, from the guilty and innocent alike. "The police report indicates you were found 3 blocks from the pharmacy at 2 a.m., with prescription medications in your backpack that match those stolen from the pharmacy, along with $212 in cash from the register." "I found that backpack, sir," Darius said, his voice gaining the slightest edge of urgency. "In the alley behind Grayson Street. I was just looking inside it when the police came." "At 2 a.m.? Harmon raised an eyebrow. "Why weren't you at home?" A flicker of something, pain perhaps, crossed the boy's face before his expression closed again. "Sometimes it's better not to be at home, sir." That response gave the judge pause. He glanced down at the file again, noting the sparse family history. Mother deceased 4 years ago. Father unknown, currently in the custody of maternal grandmother, along with 3 younger siblings. "Your Honor," Ms. Chen interjected, "we have evidence that Darius's home situation is complicated. His grandmother works 2 jobs, and Darius often takes responsibility for his younger siblings. The night in question, there was an incident with his grandmother's boyfriend that made the home environment unsafe. Judge Harmon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The case was becoming more complex than the simple repeat offender narrative the prosecution had presented. Still, the evidence was compelling, and the boy's record didn't help his case. Mr. Jackson, while I sympathize with difficult home situations, being on the streets at 2 a.m. rarely leads to good decisions. The evidence against you is substantial. Your previous chances on probation have not resulted in behavioral changes. Darius finally looked up, meeting the judge's gaze directly for the first time. There was something in those dark brown eyes, not defiance as Harmon had expected, but a weariness that seemed too profound for someone so young. "I'm trying, sir," he said quietly. "I really am." For a brief moment, something flickered in Judge Harmon's memory. A face, a voice from long ago. But he pushed it aside, returning to the matter at hand. The court finds that the defendant poses a flight risk and, given the pattern of escalating offenses, a potential danger to the community. Darius Jackson will be remanded to the Millfield County Juvenile Detention Center until trial, which is set for 3 weeks from today. As he brought down the gavel, Harmon noticed the boy's shoulders slump in resignation. Not anger, not protest, just the quiet acceptance of someone who expected nothing different from the world. Ms. Chen leaned in, whispering something to her client that Harmon couldn't hear. The boy nodded mechanically as the bailiff approached to lead him away. "Next case," Harmon called, already shifting his attention to the next file. But something about this case lingered in his mind throughout the afternoon's proceedings. There was nothing particularly unusual about it, just one of dozens of troubled teens who passed through his courtroom each month. Yet he found his thoughts returning to the weary eyes of Darius Jackson, to that moment of recognition he couldn't quite place. That evening, as Judge Harmon drove home to his spacious colonial in Millfield's affluent north side, the boy's words echoed in his mind. "Sometimes it's better not to be at home, sir." Richard Harmon knew something about that. He'd grown up in Millfield's south side, in a small house with a father whose mood could darken with his 6th beer. He'd escaped through education, through relentless work, through a determination that had carried him through law school and eventually to the bench. He'd left that life behind, rarely thinking about the boy he'd once been. His wife, Margaret, greeted him at the door with a kiss. "Tough day?" she asked, noting the furrow between his brows. "Just the usual," he replied, hanging up his coat. "How was the hospital board meeting?" As Margaret chatted about hospital funding and new equipment, Richard's mind drifted back to the courtroom, to Darius Jackson. Something about the boy nagged at him, like a splinter beneath the skin that he couldn't quite locate. After dinner, he retreated to his home office, telling Margaret he needed to review some case files. Instead, he pulled up the complete record on Darius Jackson. The bare-bones family history listed the boy's mother as Shanice Jackson, deceased 2019, cause of death, complications from pneumonia. Father, unknown. The unknown snagged Harmon's attention. Not listed or absent, but specifically unknown. He scrolled further, looking for any additional family information. The grandmother, Lucille Jackson, age 67, had taken custody of all 4 children after her daughter's death. Darius, the oldest at 17, then Mia, 14, Trayvon, 10, and little Amara, just 7. As he read the probation officer's more detailed report, the picture that emerged was more complex than it had appeared in court. Darius had no disciplinary issues in school until after his mother's death. His grades, once solidly average, had plummeted. The first arrest for shoplifting had been for children's cold medicine and food. The truancy reports showed a pattern. He missed school most often when his youngest sister was ill, or when his grandmother had to work double shifts. Richard leaned back in his chair, a heaviness settling in his chest. The narrative was shifting from troubled teen to overwhelmed caretaker before his eyes. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter Caroline, a sophomore at Princeton. "Hey Dad, just aced my constitutional law midterm. All those dinner table debates paid off." He smiled, typing back his congratulations. As he set the phone down, his eyes fell on the family photo on his desk. Margaret, Caroline, and himself at Caroline's high school graduation. Their smiling faces captured a moment of perfect family pride. How different would Caroline's life have been, he wondered, if Margaret had died when she was 13? If she'd had to help raise 3 younger siblings while he worked 2 minimum-wage jobs? With a sigh, Richard closed the file. He'd seen thousands of sad stories in his courtroom. He couldn't let this one particular case get under his skin. The evidence was clear, regardless of the circumstances. The justice system had to maintain its standards. Still, as he prepared for bed that night, Darius Jackson's weary eyes followed him into his dreams, merging strangely with memories from his own long-buried past. The next morning, Judge Harmon arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual, nodding to the security guards as he made his way to his chambers. His clerk, Amanda, looked up in surprise. "You're in early, Judge. The Collins trial doesn't start until 10. "Just catching up on some paperwork," he replied, closing his office door. Instead of reviewing the Collins case, however, he found himself reopening Darius Jackson's file, examining details he'd glossed over the day before. The boy had maintained a part-time job at a local grocery store for the past 2 years, despite his other struggles. His school attendance had improved in the last semester. His juvenile record showed no violence, no drug offenses. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Amanda peeked in, holding a folder. "Sorry to disturb you, Judge, but Ms. Chen just dropped this off. She said it's additional evidence for the Jackson case that she didn't have yesterday." Richard took the folder with a nod of thanks. Inside was a handwritten letter from Darius's English teacher, attesting to the boy's improved effort and his commitment to his siblings' education. There were also 3 children's drawings, clearly from the younger siblings, with messages like, "Come home soon, Dee, and we miss you." The last item in the folder made his breath catch, a photograph of Darius with his 3 siblings and their mother, taken shortly before her death. The woman in the photo, Shanice Jackson, was smiling broadly, her arm around her oldest son, her other children clustered close. That face. Something about that face stirred a memory so deep that Richard felt the room tilt slightly. Where had he seen her before? Richard Harmon stared at the photograph, a cold sensation spreading through his chest. Shanice Jackson's smile triggered something in his memory, a flash of recognition that vanished when he tried to focus on it. He'd seen thousands of people in his courtroom over the years. Perhaps she'd appeared before him in some minor case. Yet this felt more personal, as if she'd been part of his life rather than his professional work. He flipped the photograph over. On the back, someone had written, "Family Picnic, Mercer Park, 2018, in flowing handwriting. Mercer Park." The name struck a chord. Richard had grown up near there, in the small house on Teller Street that he'd been so eager to leave behind. His father had been the groundskeeper at Mercer Park until his drinking had cost him the job. Richard hadn't visited that part of town in decades. A knock at his door snapped him back to the present. "Judge, the Collins trial is starting in 15 minutes, Amanda reminded him. "Thank you," he replied, carefully returning the materials to the folder. He'd have to examine this later. The Collins trial dragged through the morning, a complicated civil case involving contract disputes between 2 manufacturing companies. Richard forced himself to focus, but his mind kept wandering back to the photograph, to the nagging feeling that he was missing something important. During the lunch recess, instead of joining his colleagues in the judge's dining room, Richard retreated to his chambers and called his older sister, Elizabeth. "Well, this is a rare occurrence," she answered, surprised. "Twice in 1 month. Should I be worried?" "Just wanted to check in," he said casually. "Been thinking about the old neighborhood lately." "Nostalgic for Teller Street? That's a first," Elizabeth laughed. "You couldn't wait to shake the South Side dust from your feet once you got that scholarship." "I wasn't that bad," Richard protested, though he knew there was truth in her words. "You stopped coming to family gatherings for years, Richard, Mom's funeral notwithstanding." He winced at the reminder. "That's ancient history, Liz. I'm calling because I was trying to remember some of the families from the neighborhood. Do you recall anyone named Jackson? Specifically a woman named Shanice Jackson?" The pause on the other end of the line lasted just a beat too long. "Liz? Why are you asking about Shanice?" Elizabeth's voice had lost its teasing tone. "You do know her," Richard said, his suspicion confirmed. "Did she live near us?" Another pause. "Richard, what's this about?" "I had her son in my courtroom yesterday. Something seemed familiar, but I couldn't place it." "Her son," Elizabeth repeated slowly. "Darius?" Richard's grip tightened on the phone. "Yes. How do you know him?" "I volunteer at the community center sometimes. He brings his siblings to the after-school program." She hesitated. "Richard, are you saying you didn't recognize who he was?" "Should I have?" The cold feeling returned, spreading from his chest to his limbs. "Oh, Richard." His sister's voice had taken on a strange quality, part sympathy, part disbelief. "You really don't know?" "Know what, Elizabeth? Stop being cryptic." "Shanice used to be Shanice Roberts before she married. Her mother was Delia Roberts." The name hit Richard like a physical blow. Delia Roberts had lived 3 houses down from them on Teller Street. Her daughter Shanice had been a few years behind him in school. "I remember them," he said slowly. "But what does that have to do with—" "Shanice was dating Jordan Taylor back in high school," Elizabeth interrupted. "You remember him?" Jordan Taylor. Of course Richard remembered him. They'd been best friends throughout high school, inseparable until that final summer before college, when everything had fallen apart between them. "What are you saying, Liz?" His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "I'm saying that after you left for college, Shanice discovered she was pregnant. Jordan had already enlisted in the army by then. She tried to contact him, but what? There was some confusion. Your address mix-up, remember? She sent letters to your dorm, but you'd changed rooms." Richard's mind raced back to that chaotic first year at Yale, when a housing issue had forced him to switch dorms mid-semester. Several weeks of mail had gone missing in the shuffle. "Are you telling me that Darius Jackson is Jordan's son?" Richard asked, trying to process this revelation. Elizabeth's response stopped his heart. "No, Richard. I'm telling you that according to Shanice, Darius Jackson is your son." The courtroom phone rang, startling Richard from his shocked silence. Amanda's voice came through the speaker. "Judge, everyone's waiting in the courtroom." I'll be right there," he managed, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. He turned back to his cell phone. "Liz, this is impossible. I never—" "The spring break party at the Taylor house, Richard. March 1006. Jordan's parents were away. You and Shanice disappeared upstairs for hours. You were leaving for the internship in Boston the next week. Ring any bells now?" The memory crashed over him like a wave, a night he'd buried so deeply he'd convinced himself it never happened. The celebration before his prestigious summer internship. Too many drinks. Shanice's dark eyes, her gentle laugh. The impulsive decision that had seemed consequence-free in the moment. "I need to go," he said abruptly. "I'll call you back." Richard hung up and sat motionless, his world tilting on its axis. It couldn't be true. He'd only had that one encounter with Shanice. He'd left town immediately after, throwing himself into his internship, then his studies. When he'd returned to Millfield years later as an assistant district attorney, he'd settled in the affluent North Side, rarely venturing to his old neighborhood. Had he really had a son all these years without knowing? A son he'd just sent to juvenile detention? The courtroom phone rang again. "Judge Harmon, the attorneys are getting restless." "Tell them I've been called away on an emergency," Richard said, making a split-second decision. "We'll reconvene tomorrow morning." He gathered his things quickly, ignoring Amanda's surprised questions as he strode past her desk. He needed answers, and he needed them now. 40 minutes later, Richard parked his BMW on a street he hadn't visited in over 3 decades. Teller Street had aged poorly, more houses with peeling paint and sagging porches than he remembered. His family's old house had been repainted a garish yellow, the front yard now concrete instead of the patchy grass he recalled. 3 doors down, the Roberts house looked largely unchanged, though the porch swing where Delia Roberts used to sit was long gone. Richard approached slowly, his heart pounding as if he were trespassing rather than visiting a public street. Before he could decide whether to knock, the door opened. An elderly woman with silver-streaked hair stood in the doorway, leaning on a cane, her eyes widening in recognition. "Richard Harmon," she said, not a question but a statement of fact. "After all these years." "Mrs. Roberts," he acknowledged. "I was hoping we could talk." She studied him for a long moment, then stepped back to allow him entry. "I suppose it's about time." The interior of the house was modest but immaculate, family photos covering nearly every wall. Richard's gaze was immediately drawn to a graduation picture of a teenage boy in cap and gown. Darius, a few years younger, his smile more carefree than the solemn young man who had stood in Richard's courtroom. "When did you finally figure it out?" Delia Roberts asked, lowering herself carefully into an armchair. "I didn't," Richard admitted, remaining standing. "My sister told me less than an hour ago. I came straight here." He paused, gathering his courage. "Mrs. Roberts, is it true? Is Darius my son?" "Shanice believed he was," she replied evenly. "She tried to tell you back when she found out. Sent letters to that fancy college of yours." "I never received them," Richard said, a hollow feeling expanding in his chest. "There was a mix-up with my housing. I switched dorms." "That's what Jordan said when he came back on leave. He tried to find you for her, but by then you'd made it clear you wanted nothing to do with this neighborhood." The accusation stung because it contained more truth than Richard wanted to admit. He had deliberately distanced himself from his roots, ashamed of his alcoholic father, determined to reinvent himself as someone worthy of the privileged world he'd entered through his scholarship. "Why didn't anyone try again? Later, when I came back to Millfield." Delia's expression hardened. By then, Shanice had married Thomas Jackson. He adopted Darius, gave him his name, loved him like his own. They had 3 more children together before Thomas was killed in that construction accident. Shanice was trying to hold things together as a single mother when she got sick. She shook her head sadly. That pneumonia took her so fast. Richard sank onto the couch, the weight of these revelations crushing him. "I had no idea. All these years." "You didn't want to know," Delia said simply. "You moved to the North Side, became a big-shot lawyer, then a judge. You made sure you never had to look back." He couldn't argue with her assessment. Hadn't he prided himself on rising above his circumstances? On building a life so different from his beginnings? "And now," Delia continued, her voice taking on an edge, "you've sent my grandson to juvenile detention. How's that for irony?" The reality of what he'd done hit Richard with fresh horror. He'd looked his own son in the eye and found him wanting, had treated him as just another statistic, another troubled teen from the wrong side of town. "I need to fix this," he said, more to himself than to Delia. "And how do you plan to do that, Judge Harmon?" The title sounded like an accusation on her lips. Richard stood, newfound determination cutting through his shock. "First, I'm going to get him released. Then I need to talk to him, tell him the truth." "And you think that'll make everything better?" Delia asked skeptically. "You think he'll welcome you with open arms after 17 years of absence?" "No," Richard said quietly. "But it's a start." As he turned to leave, Delia called after him. "Richard, he's a good boy. Despite everything, he's a good boy." The simple statement, delivered with quiet dignity, cut straight to Richard's heart. A good boy. His boy. A son he'd never known, never protected, never provided for. A son he'd judged and condemned without ever seeing himself in those dark, weary eyes. The Millfield County Juvenile Detention Center was a stark, concrete building on the outskirts of town, surrounded by chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Richard had sentenced countless young offenders to this facility over the years, never giving much thought to what happened to them once they passed through its heavy metal doors. Now, as he parked in the visitor's lot, he saw the place through new eyes. The institutional green paint, the narrow windows, the surveillance cameras mounted at every corner. This was where his son, had spent the night because of his decision. He approached the front desk, judicial ID in hand. Judge Richard Harmon to see Darius Jackson. The receptionist blinked in surprise. "Judge Harmon? We don't usually get... visiting hours aren't until tomorrow." "This is an urgent judicial matter," Richard said, summoning his courtroom authority. "I need to see him immediately." While the receptionist made calls to clear his unusual request, Richard glanced around the waiting area. Faded motivational posters hung on the walls, their inspirational messages at odds with the institutional bleakness. A worn pamphlet rack offered brochures on substance abuse, anger management, and GED programs. Had he really convinced himself that sending kids here was always in their best interest? That this environment fostered rehabilitation rather than resentment? "Judge Harmon? Director Phillips will see you now." He was escorted to a small office where Marcus Phillips, a former prosecutor who'd taken over as facility director 5 years ago, greeted him with obvious confusion. "Judge, this is unexpected. What brings you to our humble establishment?" "I need to speak with Darius Jackson," Richard said, cutting straight to the point. "And I'll be issuing an order for his immediate release." Phillips's eyebrows shot up. "The kid you just sent us yesterday? On what grounds?" "New evidence has come to light," Richard said vaguely. "I'll be ordering electronic monitoring instead." "All due respect, Judge, but that's highly irregular. The prosecutor's office will want to weigh in and—" "I'm aware of the protocols, Marcus," Richard interrupted. "I'll handle the procedural aspects. Right now, I need to speak with Darius, privately." Phillips studied him curiously but knew better than to argue with a judge. "I'll have him brought to the interview room." 10 minutes later, Richard sat at a small metal table, his hands clasped tightly to hide their trembling. The door opened, and a guard ushered Darius in, the boy's wrists cuffed in front of him. The orange jumpsuit hung even more loosely on his frame than Richard remembered, making him look younger and more vulnerable. "The cuffs aren't necessary," Richard told the guard sharply. "Remove them and wait outside." The guard complied, though not without a questioning glance. Once they were alone, Darius stood awkwardly by the door, confusion evident on his face. "Have a seat," Richard said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Darius complied cautiously. "Am I in more trouble, sir?" The "sir" hit Richard like a physical blow. So formal, so distant. This boy, who was his flesh and blood, addressed him with the impersonal respect demanded by his position, not the familiarity of family. "No," Richard assured him quickly. "Quite the opposite. I'm ordering your release pending trial." Darius's eyes widened, a flicker of hope quickly replaced by suspicion. Why? It was a fair question. Nothing in Darius's experience would have prepared him for such an abrupt reversal from an authority figure. Richard struggled to find the right words. "I've reviewed additional evidence," he began formally, then stopped himself. This wasn't a court proceeding. "The truth is, I made a mistake. I should have looked more carefully at your situation before making my ruling." Darius remained silent, watching him warily. "You'll be released today with an electronic monitor. You'll need to check in with a probation officer twice a week, but you can go home to your family." Richard paused, then added, "I understand things are difficult at home sometimes, with your grandmother's boyfriend." Darius tensed. "Is that what this is about? You feeling sorry for me?" "No," Richard said. "It's about justice. Real justice, not just processing cases." The boy studied him, clearly not buying this explanation. "My lawyer said you never change your mind. She said you're known for sticking to your decisions, even when the appeals court tells you you're wrong." Richard winced internally. It was true. He prided himself on his consistency, on not being swayed by emotional appeals. Until today. "Sometimes new information requires a new perspective," he said carefully. "Darius, I'd like to ask you something about your mother." The change of subject caught Darius off guard. "My mother?" "Shanice," Richard clarified unnecessarily. "I understand she passed away 4 years ago. I'm very sorry for your loss." Darius's expression closed immediately. "What about her?" Richard hesitated. This sterile interview room, with its institutional lighting and surveillance camera in the corner, was hardly the place for the conversation they needed to have. Yet he couldn't bear to let the boy spend another night here. "Did she ever tell you about your biological father?" Darius stiffened. "Why are you asking me that?" "Please, it's important." The boy's jaw worked as he considered the question. "She told me he went away to college before she knew she was pregnant, that she tried to tell him, but he never answered her letters. That's all I know." His eyes narrowed. "What does this have to do with anything?" "Everything," Richard wanted to say. "It has to do with everything." Instead, he said, "I knew your mother a long time ago. We grew up in the same neighborhood." "On Teller Street," Darius said, a hint of surprise breaking through his guardedness. "You're from the South Side?" Richard nodded. 3 houses down from your grandmother. Your mother was a few years younger than me in school." Darius absorbed this information, clearly trying to reconcile it with the imposing figure who'd sentenced him just yesterday. "She never mentioned knowing a judge." "I wasn't a judge then," Richard said softly. "Just a kid from the neighborhood trying to get out." He paused, gathering his courage. "Darius, there's something important I need to tell you. But this isn't the right place. Once you're released?" "Why do you care?" Darius interrupted, frustration breaking through his careful composure. "Yesterday you couldn't wait to lock me up. Today you're asking about my mom and talking about growing up in my neighborhood. What's really going on?" Richard met the boy's gaze directly. "I believe I may have made a terrible mistake. Not just yesterday, but for many years. I'd like a chance to explain once you're home with your family." Darius studied him with those dark, intelligent eyes, Shanice's eyes, searching for the truth behind the words. Finally, he gave a small nod. "Whatever, as long as I can go home." "You can. Today." Richard stood. "I'll make the arrangements now." 3 hours later, after expedited paperwork, conversations with the prosecutor's office, and the fitting of an ankle monitor, Darius was officially released into his grandmother's custody. Richard watched from his car as Lucille Jackson embraced her grandson tightly in the detention center parking lot, the old woman's relief palpable even from a distance. She cast a suspicious glance in Richard's direction before ushering Darius into her aged Corolla. Richard followed them at a discreet distance. He had no right to intrude on their reunion, but he needed to know where they lived, needed to prepare himself for the conversation to come. The Jackson home turned out to be a small duplex in a working-class neighborhood on the city's east side, modest but well-maintained, with cheerful curtains in the windows and a bicycle chained to the porch railing. As Darius disappeared inside, greeted by the excited voices of younger children, Richard sat in his car, overcome by the magnitude of what he'd discovered and what still lay ahead. His phone had been buzzing periodically throughout the afternoon, his clerk wondering about his whereabouts, the chief judge questioning his abrupt departure from court, Margaret asking if he'd be home for dinner. He ignored them all, unable to formulate responses that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a man whose world had just been turned upside down. Eventually, he drove home to the north side, to the spacious house where no one would understand what had happened to him today. Margaret greeted him with concern. "Richard, where have you been? Amanda said you left the courthouse for an emergency. Is everything all right?" He looked at his wife of 27 years, this woman who had shared his life, raised their daughter, supported his career. How could he possibly explain? "I need to sit down," he said, his voice unsteady. Margaret followed him to the living room, her concern deepening. "Richard, you're scaring me. What's happened?" He sank into his favorite armchair, feeling the weight of decades of ignorance and absence pressing down on him. "I have a son," he said finally, the words strange in his mouth. "A 17-year-old son I never knew existed." Margaret stared at him in stunned silence, her expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and the beginnings of anger. "What are you talking about? Whose son?" "Mine," Richard said, the reality of it still sinking in. "Biologically mine. From before we met, before college. His mother tried to tell me, but I never got her letters." This is insane," Margaret said, dropping onto the sofa across from him. "How can you possibly know this is true? Who is this woman claiming you fathered her child?" "She's not claiming anything," Richard said quietly. "She died 4 years ago. Her name was Shanice Jackson. We grew up in the same neighborhood." Margaret's expression shifted as she processed this information. "And you're just finding this out now? After 17 years? Richard, this could be anyone trying to take advantage of your position, your money." "It's not like that," he interrupted. "No one was looking for me. In fact," he trailed off, the painful irony washing over him again. "The boy was in my courtroom yesterday. I sentenced him to juvenile detention without having any idea who he was." "You what?" Margaret's voice rose sharply. "You sentenced your own son to juvenile detention? Richard, do you hear how absurd this sounds?" Richard ran a hand over his face. "I know how it sounds. But I've spoken to my sister, to the boy's grandmother. The timing fits. And when I look at him..." He trailed off, remembering Darius's expressions, the set of his jaw. "I can see myself in him." Margaret stood abruptly and paced the living room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Let's say this is true. Let's say you had some encounter with this woman before we met, and it resulted in a child. Why come forward now? Why not years ago?" "She did try, Margaret. She sent letters to my college address, but I'd changed dorms. By the time I came back to Millfield, she'd married someone else. He adopted the boy, gave him his name." "And you never suspected? In all these years?" Margaret's voice held a note of disbelief that stung. "Why would I? I had no reason to think..." He stopped, knowing how hollow his defense sounded. Margaret sank back onto the sofa, her shoulders slumped. "So what happens now?" What do you want to happen? It was the question Richard had been asking himself all afternoon. What did he want? What could he possibly expect? I need to tell him the truth, he said finally. Beyond that? I don't know. He's 17. He has a family, siblings, his grandmother. I can't just barge into his life and expect what? That he'll call you Dad and come for Sunday dinners? Margaret's words were sharp, but her eyes showed more confusion than anger. And what about Caroline? Have you thought about how this will affect her? Caroline, his daughter, his only child, as he'd always thought. How would she react to learning she had a half-brother? I'll have to tell her, Richard said, though the prospect filled him with dread. Caroline had always been proud of her father, the respected judge. How would she feel knowing he'd unknowingly abandoned another child? Margaret stood again, her composure returning in increments. You need to be certain, Richard. Before you disrupt everyone's lives, you need to be absolutely certain. A DNA test, he nodded. I know, but I'm not waiting for results to talk to him. He deserves to know why I've suddenly taken an interest in his life. And what will that accomplish, Richard? This boy has grown up without you. He has his own family, his own life. What good will it do to tell him that the man who just sent him to juvenile detention might be his biological father? Her words gave him pause. She had a point. What right did he have to upend Darius's life with this revelation? But the alternative seemed equally wrong. To know the truth and keep it from Darius felt like another abandonment, another abdication of responsibility. I need to do this, he said firmly. Whatever happens afterward, he deserves the truth. Margaret studied him for a long moment, then nodded slightly. I've never seen you like this. So, shaken. She took a deep breath. When will you tell him? Tomorrow. I'll go to their house in the morning. Do you want me to come with you? The offer surprised him. No, he said gently. This first conversation needs to be between him and me. That night, Richard barely slept. He kept picturing Darius's face. First the guarded expression in the courtroom, then the confusion in the detention center interview room. How would he look when he learned the truth? Angry? Hurt? Indifferent? By morning, Richard felt hollowed out by anxiety and lack of sleep. He called the courthouse to say he wouldn't be in, citing a family emergency. The words felt strange in his mouth. A family emergency that his family hadn't known about until yesterday. The drive to the east side seemed both too long and too short. He'd rehearsed what he would say dozens of times during the sleepless night, but every opening line felt inadequate. How did one begin such a conversation? I believe I'm your biological father seemed both too blunt and too tentative. The Jackson house looked different in the morning light. Smaller, more worn at the edges, but with touches that spoke of care despite limited means. Potted plants lined the porch steps. A wind chime tinkled softly in the breeze. Children's artwork was taped inside the front window. Richard sat in his car for several minutes, gathering his courage. Finally, he approached the house and knocked on the door. A girl of about 14 answered, her resemblance to Darius immediately apparent in the shape of her eyes and the set of her mouth. This would be Mia, the sister closest to Darius in age. Yes? She asked, eyeing him warily. I'm Judge Harmon, he said, immediately regretting the formal introduction. I'm here to see Darius. Is he home? Her wariness increased. Why? He's doing everything he's supposed to with that ankle thing. He hasn't violated anything. I know. He's not in trouble. I just need to speak with him about something important. Mia? Who is it? Lucille Jackson appeared behind her granddaughter, her expression hardening when she saw Richard. Judge Harmon, twice in 2 days. To what do we owe this honor? There was no mistaking the sarcasm in her tone. Richard couldn't blame her. "Mrs. Jackson, I need to speak with Darius. It's important." "He's not here," she said flatly. "He's at work." "Work? But he was just released yesterday." "And he has 3 siblings to help support," Lucille replied. "The grocery store held his position. He's there until 3. Richard hesitated. "Mrs. Jackson, did your daughter ever tell you about Darius's biological father?" Something shifted in Lucille's expression, a softening, or perhaps just resignation. "Shanice told me he was some college boy who never bothered to answer her letters. She didn't talk about it much." She studied him more carefully. "Are you saying that was you?" "I believe so," Richard admitted. "I never knew. I never received her letters. I just found out yesterday when I recognized her picture." Lucille absorbed this information silently, then glanced back at Mia, who was listening with obvious curiosity. "Mia, go check on Amara. Make sure she's finished her breakfast." Once the girl had reluctantly retreated, Lucille stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind her. "So, after 17 years, you show up on my doorstep wanting what exactly? Forgiveness? A relationship with a boy you sent to juvie just 2 days ago?" Put that way, it sounded absurd, even to Richard. "I don't know what I want," he admitted. "I just know I can't pretend I haven't learned this truth. I can't go back to my life as if nothing has changed." Lucille's hard expression softened slightly. Thomas Jackson was Darius's father in every way that matters. He taught that boy to ride a bike, helped him with his homework, loved him like his own. Don't you come in here thinking you can replace that. "I would never presume," Richard said quickly. I need to tell him the truth." Lucille considered this, then sighed heavily. "Millfield Market on Wilson Street. That's where he works. But don't you dare upset him at his job. That boy has enough challenges without you adding to them." "I understand. Thank you, Mrs. Jackson." As he turned to leave, Lucille called after him. "Judge, Darius is a good kid. He didn't do what they're saying he did. That backpack wasn't his." Richard nodded. "I believe you. I'll look into it." Millfield Market was a local grocery store that had somehow survived the influx of national chains. Richard remembered it from his youth. His mother had shopped there for its slightly lower prices, despite his father's complaints about the longer drive. He found Darius in the back, unloading produce from crates and arranging it carefully on the display. The boy worked methodically, his movements efficient despite the ankle monitor visible beneath his uniform pants. Richard watched him for a moment, struck by the responsibility evident in such a simple task. How many 17-year-olds took such care with minimum wage work? "Darius." The boy looked up, surprise quickly replaced by wariness when he recognized Richard. He glanced around as if concerned about being seen talking to the judge who had sentenced him. "Sir, is something wrong with my release?" "No, everything's fine with that," Richard assured him quickly. "I was hoping we could talk." "When you're on break, perhaps?" Darius checked his watch. "I get 15 minutes at noon." "I'll wait," Richard said. "If that's all right." Darius shrugged, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to argue with the man who controlled his freedom. "Whatever you want. I'll be in the break room at 12. Richard retreated to his car, where he spent the next hour alternating between rehearsing what he would say and doubting whether he should say anything at all. Margaret's question echoed in his mind. What good would it do to tell Darius the truth? Wouldn't it just add more complication to an already difficult life? Yet as noon approached, Richard knew he couldn't walk away. He owed Darius the truth, whatever came of it. He returned to the store and asked a cashier to direct him to the break room. It was a small, cramped space with a wobbly table, a few folding chairs, and a microwave that had seen better days. Darius was already there, eating a sandwich from a paper bag. "Judge Harmon," he acknowledged, his expression guarded. You waited. I said I would, Richard replied, taking the seat across from him. Thank you for agreeing to talk with me. Darius took another bite of his sandwich, chewing slowly. Not like I could really say no. You're the judge handling my case. The observation stung with its accuracy. There was an inherent power imbalance that Richard couldn't deny. After this conversation, I'll be recusing myself from your case, he said. Another judge will take over. Darius's eyebrows rose slightly. Why? Richard took a deep breath. This was the moment. There was no perfect way to say it, no gentle introduction that would adequately prepare either of them. Because I have reason to believe I'm your biological father. Darius stared at Richard, his sandwich forgotten in his hand. The break room's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the only sound in the sudden silence that enveloped them. That's not funny, Darius finally said, his voice low and controlled. I'm not trying to be funny, Richard responded. I only discovered this yesterday, when I saw the photograph of your mother in the materials your lawyer submitted. Darius set down his sandwich, his appetite clearly gone. So you're telling me that you, and my mom. He couldn't finish the sentence, the implication too strange to verbalize. We grew up in the same neighborhood, Richard explained, his words coming faster now that he'd crossed the threshold of revelation. There was a party, spring break of my senior year before I left for college. Your mother and I, we spent some time together. It was just once. I left for an internship the next week, then started at Yale that fall. I had no idea she was pregnant. She tried to contact me, but I'd changed dorm rooms due to a housing issue. Her letters never reached me. Darius's face remained impassive, but his eyes revealed a storm of emotions. Disbelief, confusion, the beginnings of anger. Why are you telling me this now? He asked. After all these years? After sending me to juvie? The accusation was fair. Richard struggled to find the right words. Because it's the truth, and you deserve to know it. I wish I'd known years ago. I wish I'd been there for you and your mother. My mother had a husband, Darius said sharply. Thomas Jackson was my father. He's the one who raised me, the one who taught me things, the one who... His voice caught, and he looked away, composing himself. He died when I was 9. Construction accident. I know, Richard said softly. Your grandmother told me. He sounds like he was a good man. He was the best. Darius's loyalty to his adoptive father was evident in every word. So what exactly do you want from me now, Judge Harmon? You want me to start calling you Dad? You want to play catch in the backyard and make up for lost time? The bitter sarcasm stung, but Richard couldn't blame him for it. I don't expect anything, he said honestly. I just thought you should know the truth. What happens next? That's up to you. Darius laughed, a short, harsh sound without humor. Up to me? Nothing in my life has ever been up to me. Not where I live, not how many jobs I need to work to help Grandma pay the bills, not whether I go to juvie because somebody planted a backpack near me. His voice rose with each example, years of frustration bubbling to the surface. I understand you're angry. You don't understand anything about me. Darius cut him off. You sat up there on your bench for all of 10 minutes before deciding I was just another thug from the South Side who needed to be locked up. Now suddenly you think you're my father, and everything's supposed to be different? Richard flinched at the raw pain in the boy's voice. You're right. I made assumptions about you based on the barest facts. I didn't see you, the real you. I'm sorry for that. Darius stared at him, clearly thrown by the apology. Judges didn't apologize to defendants, especially not ones they believed were guilty. What about my case? He asked finally. You said you're recusing yourself. Yes. Judge Martinez will take over. She's fair. What about the charges? You said yesterday you'd look into it. Richard nodded. I've already spoken to the DA's office this morning. They're reviewing the evidence, including the security camera footage from the area. There's footage? Darius sat up straighter. That would show I was telling the truth, that I just found that backpack. If that's what happened, yes, it should show that. Richard hesitated, then added, Darius, regardless of how you feel about what I've told you today, I want to help with your case. Not as a judge, but perhaps I could recommend a better attorney than the public defender's office can provide. Darius's expression closed again. We can't afford a fancy lawyer. I would cover the cost, Richard said. It's the least I could. No. Darius's response was immediate and firm. We don't need your money. The rejection was swift but not surprising. Pride ran strong in the Jackson family. Richard had seen it in Lucille's straight back and steady gaze, and now he saw it in Darius. I understand, he said, though part of him wanted to insist. This boy, his son, was facing serious charges that could affect the rest of his life. But pushing too hard now would only drive him further away. Darius checked his watch. My break's almost over. I need to get back to work. Of course. Richard stood, suddenly unsure how to end this momentous conversation. Should he offer a handshake? That seemed too formal. A hug was unthinkable at this stage. He settled for simply asking, May I contact you again? Perhaps we could talk more when you're not working. Darius gathered his lunch trash, his movements deliberate. I don't know, he said finally. I need to think about all this. It wasn't a no. Richard clung to that small hope. I understand. Take all the time you need. I've written my personal cell number on this card. He placed his business card on the table. Call or text anytime, day or night. Darius looked at the card but didn't pick it up. I've got to go. Richard watched him leave, the ankle monitor a stark reminder of how their paths had crossed. A heaviness settled in his chest. He'd finally told the truth, but it had brought no immediate relief, no catharsis. Just more uncertainty, more complications. As he left the grocery store, his phone rang. It was the district attorney, Robert Keller. Rich, what the hell is going on? I get a call from my juvenile division saying you're requesting expedited review of the Jackson case, and now I hear you're recusing yourself. Since when do you recuse from anything? Richard sighed. The news was already spreading through the courthouse grapevine. It's complicated, Bob. I have a personal connection to the case that I wasn't aware of when I made the initial ruling. What kind of personal connection? Keller pressed. I'd rather not discuss it over the phone, but trust me, it's significant enough to warrant recusal, and the case review is important. I have reason to believe the evidence may not be as straightforward as it appeared. This isn't like you, Rich, Keller said, suspicion evident in his tone. You've never been one to second-guess charging decisions or your own rulings. Perhaps that's been my failing, Richard replied, surprising himself with the admission. Just review the evidence, Bob, particularly the security footage from the area. That's all I'm asking. After hanging up, Richard sat in his car, unsure where to go next. He couldn't return to court today, not with his mind in this state of turmoil. Home seemed equally impossible. Margaret would have questions he wasn't ready to answer, emotions he wasn't prepared to navigate. Instead, he found himself driving back to the south side, to Teller Street. He parked across from his childhood home and stared at it, memories flooding back. His father's drunken rages, his mother's quiet endurance, his own desperate determination to escape. He'd succeeded, perhaps too well. He'd left this neighborhood behind so completely that he'd lost touch with everything and everyone connected to it, including a woman who'd carried his child and a boy who'd grown up without him. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I get off at 3. We can talk at the park across from the store. Just talking, that's it. Don't make a big deal about it. Darius. He must have taken the card after all. Richard's heart raced with a mixture of anxiety and hope. A second chance, however small, however tentative. He quickly texted back, "I'll be there. Thank you." The 3 hours until Darius's shift ended were among the longest of Richard's life. He drove aimlessly for a while, then stopped at a diner for coffee he barely tasted. His mind kept replaying the conversation in the break room, thinking of all the things he should have said differently, all the questions he hadn't answered well. At 2:45, he parked near the small park across from Millfield Market. It was little more than a patch of grass with a few benches and an ancient swing set, but it offered privacy, a neutral ground for their second conversation. At precisely 3:05, Darius emerged from the store, now wearing jeans and a hoodie instead of his work uniform. He crossed the street, his gait slightly uneven due to the ankle monitor. He spotted Richard on a bench and approached slowly, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "You came," Richard said, unable to hide his relief. "I said I would." Darius remained standing, maintaining the higher ground. "I have a lot of questions." "I'll answer everything I can," Richard promised. Darius took a deep breath. "First thing, how can you be sure about being my, you know?" "The timing fits," Richard said. "And when I saw your mother's picture, I remembered her immediately. But you're right to question it. We should do a DNA test to be certain." "And if it's negative, you'll just go back to being the judge who sent me to juvie?" The question carried a weight beyond its words, a test of Richard's intentions, his sincerity. "No," Richard said firmly. "Regardless of what a DNA test shows, I've seen enough to know that I was wrong about you, about your case. I'll still help however I can, if you'll let me." Darius studied him, searching for deception. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, at least partially, because he finally sat down on the bench, keeping a careful distance between them. "Tell me about my mom," he said. "What was she like back then, before she met Thomas?" Richard's mind traveled back through decades, sifting through memories he hadn't revisited in years. Shanice Roberts. She'd been 3 years behind him in school, a quiet girl with an infectious laugh who always had a book in her hand. "Your mother was smart," he began. "Really smart. She used to win all the spelling bees in elementary school, and she loved to read, always had her nose in a book. The neighborhood kids used to tease her about it, but she didn't care." Darius's expression softened slightly. "She read to us every night when we were little. Even after working double shifts, she'd never skip it." The image of Shanice, exhausted but dedicated, reading to her children, created an ache in Richard's chest, a glimpse of the life he'd missed, the woman he'd never really known. "She had this laugh," Richard continued, "that would just light up a room. And she was kind. I remember once my mom was sick, and Shanice brought over soup that her mother had made. She couldn't have been more than 12 at the time. She made the best chicken soup," Darius said quietly. "Wouldn't tell anyone her secret ingredient." "Lemon thyme," Richard said without thinking. "Her mother, your grandmother, grew it in pots on their back steps." Darius looked at him sharply. "How did you know that?" I don't know. I must have seen it when I was a kid. It just came back to me." A silence fell between them, filled with the weight of shared memories of a woman who had connected their lives without either of them knowing. "What about school?" Darius asked finally. "Was she good at it? She always told us education was the most important thing." Richard nodded. "She was excellent in school, especially English and history. I remember she won an essay contest our local newspaper sponsored. It was about what she wanted for the future of our neighborhood." "Did she want to go to college?" "I think so. She certainly had the ability." Richard paused, a new realization hitting him. I never found out if she got the chance. She took classes at the community college, Darius said. Night classes after Thomas died. She was studying to be a nurse when she got sick. Another piece of Shanice's life that Richard had missed. Her dreams, her determination, her struggle to improve her family's circumstances, even as a single mother. She sounds remarkable, he said softly. She was. Darius's voice held both pride and pain. She worked so hard, especially after Thomas died. Sometimes 3 jobs at once. She'd come home so tired she could barely stand, but she'd still check our homework, make sure we had what we needed for the next day. He glanced at Richard. She never said anything bad about you, you know. Even when I asked about my biological father. The revelation surprised Richard. You asked about me? Darius shrugged. Kids get curious, especially when they're getting teased at school for having a different last name than their dad. What did she tell you? That you were smart, that you'd gone off to college out east, and that you probably never knew about me. She said Thomas was my real dad in all the ways that mattered, but that I shouldn't be angry at you for not being there. A flicker of resentment crossed his face. That was harder after she died. Richard absorbed this, amazed at Shanice's generosity of spirit. She could have painted him as a villain, a deadbeat who'd abandoned her, but instead, she'd given her son a narrative that left room for understanding. I wish I could thank her for that, he said, and for raising such a remarkable young man. Darius looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. You don't know me. I'd like to, Richard said simply, if you'll let me. Before Darius could respond, his phone buzzed. He checked it, his expression immediately shifting to concern. I've got to go. My sister Amara's running a fever, and Grandma can't leave work to pick her up from school. Can I give you a ride? Richard offered, seeing an opportunity to be useful. Darius hesitated, clearly weighing his limited options against his reluctance to accept help. Fine, but just to get Amara, then straight home. The elementary school was a 15-minute drive across town. They rode mostly in silence, the car's luxury interior a stark contrast to the worn backpack at Darius's feet. When they arrived, Darius jumped out before Richard could even properly park. Wait here, he instructed, then disappeared into the building. 5 minutes later, he emerged with a small girl whose resemblance to Shanice was startling. She couldn't have been more than 7, her hair in neat braids decorated with colorful beads, her face flushed with fever. Darius carried her with practiced ease, whispering something that made her nod weakly against his shoulder. Richard's heart twisted at the sight. This was his son, caring for his little sister with a tenderness that belied his tough exterior. And the girl, was she his half-sister? The relationship was both strange and undeniable. Darius carefully settled Amara in the back seat, buckling her in and giving her a reassuring smile before climbing into the front. Home is on Eastwood, near the community center. Is she all right? Richard asked, glancing at the girl in his rearview mirror. Just a fever. Probably the same bug Trey had last week, Darius replied, turning to check on his sister. You okay, Mara? We'll be home soon, and I'll make you some juice. I want Mom's soup, the little girl murmured. Darius's face softened with sadness. I know, baby. I'll make it as close as I can, okay? As they drove, Richard noticed how Darius kept one eye on his sister at all times, his concern evident in every glance, every soothing word. It was the behavior of someone who had become a caretaker far too young. Who watches them when you're at work? Richard asked quietly. Depends. Grandma when she's not working. Mia's old enough to watch the younger ones for short periods. We make it work. Darius's tone made it clear that this was their business, not Richard's. They pulled up to a modest duplex, its small yard neat despite the worn exterior. Darius immediately went to gather Amara from the back seat. "Thank you for the ride," he said formally, clearly ready to end their interaction. Richard hesitated, wanting to offer more help but sensing Darius's boundaries. "If you need anything for her, medicine or... we've got it covered." Darius cut him off, then seemed to reconsider his tone. "But thanks." As they reached the front door, it swung open to reveal a teenage girl, Mia, Richard presumed, her expression shifting from relief at seeing her siblings to wariness at the sight of him. "Why is he here?" she asked Darius. "He just gave us a ride. Amara's got a fever," Darius explained, moving past her into the house. "Can you get her medicine while I make some juice?" Mia nodded, her suspicious gaze still fixed on Richard. "You're the judge who sent Darius to juvie." It wasn't a question, but Richard answered anyway. "Yes. There were circumstances I wasn't aware of at the time." "You mean you didn't bother to find out?" she said bluntly. "You just looked at him and saw what you expected to see." Out of the mouths of babes. Her assessment stung precisely because it contained so much truth. "You're right," he admitted, "and I'm trying to make that right now." Something in his candor seemed to surprise her. She studied him for a moment longer, then said, "Darius said you might be his biological dad. Are you?" "I believe so. We're going to do a DNA test to be certain." Mia crossed her arms. "And then what? You think you can just walk in here and be part of our family after 17 years? It was the same question Darius had asked, the same challenge to his motives. Richard gave her the same honest answer. "I don't know what happens next. That's not just up to me." From inside, Darius called for his sister. She gave Richard one last measuring look before closing the door, leaving him alone on the porch. He returned to his car, the reality of Darius's life now clearer than ever. The boy wasn't just dealing with the normal challenges of adolescence, or even the abnormal pressures of poverty and loss. He had essentially become a parent to his younger siblings, shouldering responsibilities that would overwhelm most adults. Richard's phone rang as he sat in his car. It was Robert Keller, the district attorney. "Rich, we reviewed that security footage from the West Side Pharmacy case. You were right to ask questions. The kid's story checks out. The video clearly shows someone else dropping that backpack in the alley about 20 minutes before Jackson came along." Relief flooded through Richard. "So you're dropping the charges?" "We're preparing the paperwork now. But Rich, I need to know what's going on with you in this case. The rumors flying around the courthouse are getting wild." Richard took a deep breath. "The truth is, Bob, I have reason to believe Darius Jackson is my biological son." The silence on the other end stretched so long that Richard checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Bob? Jesus Christ, Rich, are you sure?" "We're doing a DNA test, but yes, I believe so. His mother and I... It was before Margaret, before law school." "And you never knew? For 17 years?" "She tried to tell me. The letters never reached me." Even to his own ears, the explanation sounded inadequate. "I know how it looks." "It looks like a nightmare, Rich. The optics alone. A white judge sending his own black son to juvenile detention? The press will have a field day if this gets out." The potential scandal hadn't even occurred to Richard until this moment. He'd been so focused on the personal implications that he hadn't considered the public perception. "The truth matters more than the optics," he said firmly. "Get those charges dropped, Bob. That boy's had enough challenges without adding a criminal record to them." After hanging up, Richard sat in his car outside the Jackson home, watching as lights came on inside as evening approached. Through the front window he could see movement. Darius in the kitchen, likely preparing dinner for his siblings. The boy, his son, had been carrying the weight of adult responsibilities while Richard had been living his comfortable life in the North Side, oblivious to his existence. The injustice of it was staggering. His phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "When are you coming home? We need to talk about this situation." This situation. As if Darius could be reduced to a problem to be managed. Richard put the phone away without responding. For the first time in his marriage, he had no idea how to explain his feelings to his wife. By the time Richard finally returned home, it was past 8 o'clock. Margaret was waiting in the living room, her reading glasses perched on her nose, a legal brief abandoned on her lap. She looked up when he entered, her expression a complex mixture of concern and frustration. "I was beginning to think you weren't coming home at all," she said. Richard sank into his armchair, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. "I'm sorry. I don't even have words for what it's been." "Did you see him? The boy?" "Darius," Richard corrected gently. "His name is Darius. And yes, we talked. Twice, actually." He described their conversations, watching Margaret's expression shift as he spoke. "So he lives with his grandmother and 3 siblings, and he works to help support them?" she asked, her professional compassion as a hospital administrator momentarily overriding her personal concerns. "Yes. His mother died 4 years ago. His adoptive father, Thomas Jackson, died when Darius was 9. He's essentially been helping raise his siblings since then." Margaret absorbed this information, her fingers worrying the edge of her brief. "And the charges against him? You said they weren't true?" "The DA confirmed it today. Security footage backs up Darius's story. He found that backpack. He didn't steal anything. The charges are being dropped." "Well, that's something," Margaret said. "But Richard, we need to talk about what happens next. Have you thought about how this affects us? How it affects Caroline?" Richard had been dreading this question. "I called her this afternoon. We're video chatting at 9. I want to tell her myself before she hears rumors." "And what exactly are you going to tell her? That she has a half-brother she never knew about? That her father had a relationship with another woman?" "It was before you and I met," Richard reminded her. "Caroline will understand that." Will she? Or will she wonder what else her father has been hiding all these years? The question stung, not least because Richard had been asking himself the same thing. What else had he missed in his determined march from Southside poverty to Northside privilege? What other consequences of his actions had he never bothered to discover? "I need to be honest with her," he said firmly. "She's 21, not a child. She can handle the truth." Margaret sighed, removing her glasses and rubbing the bridge of her nose. "And what about us, Richard? What does this mean for our marriage?" "Nothing has changed between us," he insisted, reaching for her hand. "This was before we met, before I even knew you existed." "But it changes how I see you," Margaret said quietly. "The Richard I thought I knew would never have abandoned a child, knowingly or not, would never have failed to check if his letters were being forwarded, would never have cut ties so completely with his past that he wouldn't even hear through the grapevine that he had a son." Her words laid bare the uncomfortable truth Richard had been avoiding. This revelation didn't just change his future, it recast his past in a new and unflattering light. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, "except that I want to do better now. I need to do better." Margaret studied him, her expression softening slightly. "I believe you mean that. But Richard, you need to be realistic about what doing better looks like in this situation. Darius is almost an adult. He has his own family, his own life. What exactly are you hoping for here?" It was the question he'd been wrestling with since yesterday. What did he want from this unexpected connection? What did he have the right to expect? "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I can't just walk away now that I know the truth. I can't pretend he doesn't exist." "No one's suggesting that," Margaret said. "But there's a wide gulf between acknowledging his existence and trying to become his father at this late stage. Before Richard could respond, his laptop chimed with an incoming video call. 9 o'clock. Caroline. Margaret squeezed his hand. "I'll give you privacy for this." Richard opened his laptop with a sense of dread. His daughter's face appeared on screen, her Princeton dorm room visible in the background. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she was wearing the sweatshirt he'd given her last Christmas. "Hey, Dad," she greeted him, then frowned at his expression. "Whoa, you look terrible. Is everything okay? Mom said you needed to talk to me about something important." Richard took a deep breath. "Caroline, something unexpected has happened. I've discovered something about my past that affects all of us." He paused, searching for the right words. "It appears that I have a son, from before I met your mother." Caroline's expression froze. "What? You're saying I have a brother?" "A half-brother, yes. His name is Darius Jackson. He's 17. 17? And you're just finding out now? How is that possible?" Richard explained the circumstances as best he could. The brief relationship with Shanice, the missed letters, the coincidence that had finally brought Darius into his courtroom. Caroline listened in stunned silence, her analytical mind, so much like his own, visibly processing each piece of information. "So you sentenced him to juvenile detention without knowing who he was?" she finally asked, her voice hollow with disbelief. "Yes," Richard admitted. "Though the charges are being dropped, the evidence shows he was telling the truth." Caroline's expression hardened in a way he'd never seen before. "Would you have looked into the evidence so carefully if you hadn't discovered he might be your son?" The question hit like a physical blow. "I would like to think so," Richard said quietly, "but I can't be certain." "At least you're honest about that," Caroline said. She was silent for a long moment, then asked, "What's he like?" The question caught Richard off guard. "He's responsible, mature beyond his years. He helps care for his younger siblings, works part-time, somehow maintains passing grades despite everything. He's loyal to his family, especially the memory of his adoptive father." "He sounds remarkable," Caroline said, echoing Richard's own assessment from earlier. "When can I meet him?" Now it was Richard's turn to be surprised. "You want to meet him?" "Of course I do. He's my brother." Caroline's directness, another trait she'd inherited from him, cut through the complications to the essential truth. "I mean, assuming the DNA test confirms it, but from what you've described, it sounds pretty clear." "We're doing the test tomorrow," Richard said. "But yes, I believe he is your brother." "Then I want to meet him. I'll come home this weekend." "Caroline, it's not that simple. Darius is still coming to terms with all this. He may not be ready to meet more family yet." She considered this. "Then I'll wait until he is." "But Dad, don't shut me out of this. He's my family too." After they said goodbye, Richard sat staring at the blank screen, oddly comforted by his daughter's response. Her immediate acceptance of Darius as family, her desire to meet him. It gave him hope that perhaps in time they could all forge some kind of relationship. The next morning, Richard met Darius at a medical clinic for the DNA test. The procedure was quick and clinical, a simple cheek swab for each of them, then forms to sign authorizing the comparison. Results should be back in 3 to 5 business days, the technician informed them. They walked out together in awkward silence. "Thank you for doing this," Richard said finally. Darius shrugged. "Might as well know for sure. The DA called me last night. They're officially dropping all charges against you. Your ankle monitor should be removed today." Relief flashed across Darius's face, quickly replaced by suspicion. "Because of you? Because of..." Our situation? No, Richard said firmly. Because of the evidence. The security footage clearly shows someone else dropping that backpack in the alley before you found it. Darius nodded, absorbing this vindication. So I was telling the truth the whole time. Yes. And I should have been more thorough in examining the evidence before making my ruling. I'm sorry for that. They reached Richard's car, but Darius made no move to accept a ride. I'm meeting my probation officer to get this thing off, he said, gesturing to his ankle. Then I've got a shift at the market. Would you be willing to have dinner sometime? Richard asked. You and your siblings, your grandmother. I'd like to get to know all of you better. Darius studied him, his expression guarded. I'll ask Grandma. It's her call. It was a small opening, and Richard took it gratefully. Of course. Just let me know. As Darius walked away, Richard's phone buzzed with a text from the court administrator. Meeting in Chief Judge Wilson's chambers. 10 a.m. Urgent. Richard's stomach tightened. He'd known this was coming. The courthouse grapevine had surely been working overtime, and Judge Wilson would want answers about his unusual behavior in the Jackson case. When he arrived at the courthouse, he found not only Chief Judge Wilson waiting but also Robert Keller, the district attorney, and Grace Peterson, the court's public information officer. Their solemn expressions confirmed his suspicions. This was about damage control. Richard, Wilson began, I think you know why we're here. There are rumors circulating about your connection to a recent juvenile defendant. We need to know what we're dealing with. Richard took a seat, his judicial demeanor firmly in place despite his inner turmoil. The rumors are essentially correct. I have reason to believe, and am awaiting DNA confirmation, that Darius Jackson is my biological son from a relationship prior to my marriage. I was unaware of his existence until I recognized his mother in a photograph submitted by defense counsel. Peterson scribbled notes rapidly. Judge Harmon, with all due respect, this is a potential media nightmare. A white judge sentencing his own biracial son to juvenile detention? The racial and ethical implications alone. I'm well aware of how it looks, Richard interrupted. But I'm more concerned with how it is. I made a ruling without all the facts, both personal and evidential. I've since recused myself from the case, and the charges against Darius have been dropped based on clear exculpatory evidence. The question is how we manage this publicly, Wilson said. If the press gets wind of this. They will, Keller interjected. Something this juicy? It's just a matter of time. Wilson nodded grimly. Then we need a strategy. Richard, I think a temporary leave of absence might be advisable while we sort this out. Richard had expected this, but still felt the sting of professional rebuke. If you think that's best. It's not a punishment, Wilson assured him. It's about preserving the integrity of the court while you deal with your personal situation. As they discussed the official statement that would accompany his leave of absence, Richard felt oddly detached from the proceedings. For decades, his identity had been inextricably linked to his role as Judge Harmon. Now that identity was being set aside. Temporarily, yes, but the separation still felt profound. What would remain of Richard Harmon without the trappings of judicial authority? What would he be to Darius, to his family, to himself? The answers to those questions lay somewhere in the uncertain future, waiting to be discovered. 3 days after being placed on administrative leave, Richard found himself unmoored. The rhythms that had structured his life for decades, early mornings at the courthouse, days filled with cases and rulings, evenings of case preparation, were suddenly absent. In their place was an unsettling void, and the growing awareness of how much of his identity had been wrapped up in being Judge Harmon. He'd spent the first day organizing files in his home office, a task he'd been postponing for months. The second day, he'd attempted to read a novel, only to find himself unable to focus on the fictional narrative when his own life had become so startlingly unpredictable. Today he'd resorted to aimless driving, eventually finding himself in the parking lot of Millfield Market. He hadn't planned to come here. He'd told himself he would wait for Darius to reach out, to respect the boy's space as he processed everything. Yet here he was, watching the entrance like some lovesick teenager. His phone buzzed with a text from Caroline. "Any news on the DNA test?" "Not yet," he replied. "Should be tomorrow or the next day. I'm still coming home this weekend. Even if he's not ready to meet me, I want to be there for you." Richard smiled at his daughter's message. Her support had been one of the few bright spots in this tumultuous week. As he contemplated whether to leave or go into the market, Darius emerged, carrying a paper bag of groceries. He spotted Richard's car immediately, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness as he approached. Richard lowered his window. "I wasn't planning to ambush you," he said quickly. "I was just driving around and ended up here." Darius raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "In the middle of a workday? Aren't you supposed to be in court?" "I'm on leave," Richard admitted. "Administrative leave, while the court decides how to handle our situation." Darius absorbed this information, his expression unreadable. "So you got suspended because of me?" "Not because of you," Richard corrected. "Because of decisions I made, both recently and years ago." The boy shifted his grocery bag from one arm to the other. "I need to get these home. Grandma's making dinner. Can I give you a ride?" Darius hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, okay." They drove in silence for a few minutes before Darius spoke again. "My probation officer said all the charges were dropped, and they took the ankle monitor off." "Good," Richard said. "That's as it should be." He said it was unusual, for charges to be dropped so completely, so quickly. Richard kept his eyes on the road. The evidence was clear. "The evidence was always clear," Darius said pointedly. "Just nobody bothered to look at it before." The accusation hung in the air, impossible to deny. "You're right," Richard acknowledged. "The system failed you. I failed you." Darius seemed surprised by his candor. After a moment, he said, "My grandmother says you can come to dinner on Saturday. Just you, not your wife. She says it's too much all at once." Richard's heart leapt at the invitation, unexpected as it was. "I'd be honored. Thank you." "Don't make it a big deal," Darius warned. "Grandma just wants to size you up, and Mia won't stop pestering me about meeting you properly." "And what about you?" Richard asked carefully. "What do you want from all this?" Darius stared out the window, considering the question. "I don't know yet. Part of me thinks it would be easier if the test comes back negative." The honesty stung, but Richard appreciated it. "I can understand that. This is a lot to process." "What about you?" Darius turned the question back on him. "What do you want?" "A chance," Richard said simply. "A chance to know you, to be part of your life in whatever way makes sense. A chance to make up for lost time, though I know that's not really possible." They pulled up to the Jackson house where Mia was sitting on the porch steps, watching their arrival with obvious curiosity. "I should go," Darius said, reaching for the door handle. "Saturday at 6. Don't bring anything. Grandma's proud." "I'll remember that. Thank you, Darius." As he drove away, Richard caught Mia's interested expression in his rearview mirror. The curiosity of a sister who might be his daughter's sister. The thought made his head spin. Back at home, Richard found Margaret in the kitchen, preparing dinner with the radio tuned to the local news station. She looked up when he entered, her expression carefully neutral. "I've been invited to dinner at the Jackson house on Saturday," he told her. "Just me, they're not ready for everyone yet." Margaret nodded, returning to her chopping. "That's understandable. It's a step forward. The radio announcer's voice suddenly caught their attention. In local news, questions are swirling around the abrupt administrative leave of respected Millfield County Judge Richard Harmon. Sources close to the courthouse suggest the leave may be connected to a juvenile case that was unusually dismissed earlier this week. The court's public information officer declined to comment on the specifics, but issued a statement that Judge Harmon's leave is for personal reasons and not related to any misconduct. Margaret turned off the radio with a sharp click. It's starting. It was inevitable, Richard sighed. Grace Peterson warned me the press would get wind of it sooner or later. But they don't know the full story yet, Margaret pointed out. About Darius being your son. No, but it won't take much digging. Court records, birth certificates. Someone will connect the dots eventually. They ate dinner in strained silence, the radio report hanging over them like a cloud. Later, as Richard washed dishes, his phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Judge Harmon? This is Jessica Lane from the Millfield Gazette. I'm working on a story about your administrative leave and would like to get your comment. Richard's grip tightened on the phone. I have no comment beyond the court's official statement. This is a personal matter. Sources tell us your leave is connected to the case of Darius Jackson, a minor whose charges were dropped under unusual circumstances this week. Can you confirm your relationship with this defendant? His heart raced. They were closer to the truth than he'd expected. As I said, I have no comment. Good evening, Ms. Lane. He hung up, his hands trembling slightly. The story was gaining momentum faster than he'd anticipated. The next morning, the DNA test results arrived via email while Richard was having his morning coffee. He stared at the notification on his phone, suddenly afraid to open it. What if the test was negative? What if the connection he'd felt, the resemblance he'd glimpsed, the timing that seemed so perfect, were all coincidence? Or worse, what if it was positive? The confirmation would make this new reality inescapable, would cement his past failure and present responsibility in scientific certainty. Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway, sensing his tension. Is that it? He nodded, unable to speak. Do you want me to look first? She offered. No, he said, finding his voice. No, I need to do this. With a deep breath, he opened the email and scanned the clinical language until he found what he was looking for. Probability of paternity, 99.99999%. Conclusion: Richard Harmon cannot be excluded as the biological father of Darius Jackson. The genetic evidence supports paternity. Though he had expected this result, seeing it in black and white hit him with unexpected force. He passed the phone to Margaret wordlessly. She read it quickly, her expression softening. Oh, Richard. I need to tell him, Richard said, already reaching for his phone. Wait, Margaret cautioned. This is news that should be delivered in person, not by text. She was right, of course. But the need to share this confirmation was almost physical, a pressing urgency that demanded action. I'll go to the market, he decided. He's working today. Margaret didn't try to dissuade him, recognizing the determination in his voice. Be gentle, she advised. This confirms what you suspected, but it's still new for him. 30 minutes later, Richard stood outside Millfield Market, gathering his courage. Inside, he found Darius stocking shelves in the cereal aisle, his methodical movements a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil Richard was experiencing. Darius, he said softly. The boy looked up, immediately reading something in Richard's expression. You got the results. Richard nodded. Yes, I thought you should know right away. Darius glanced around, ensuring no customers were nearby. And? It's positive. 99.9999% certainty. I am your biological father. Darius absorbed this news with remarkable composure, though Richard noticed his hands tightening on the cereal box he held. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, "I guess dinner on Saturday is still on then." The understated response was so unexpected that Richard almost laughed. "Yes, I guess it is." "I need to get back to work," Darius said. But he seemed less eager to end the conversation than in previous encounters. "But, thanks for coming to tell me in person. Of course, this isn't the kind of news you share by text." As Richard turned to leave, Darius called after him quietly. "Are you going to tell people? Like, publicly?" The question gave Richard pause. "That would be up to you. It's your life, too." "The thing is," Darius said, his voice low, "there's already a reporter who came by the house yesterday. Asked Grandma questions about me, about my case. She didn't let them in, but they're digging." Richard's concern sharpened. "What kind of questions?" "About why my charges were dropped so fast. About whether we knew you before the case." Darius met his gaze directly. "It's going to come out, isn't it?" "Probably," Richard admitted. "These things usually do. But how we handle it, what we say, that can be on our terms." Darius nodded thoughtfully. "I need to think about it. Talk to Grandma. Take all the time you need. And Darius, I'm sorry that this complication is entering your life. You've had enough challenges without adding public scrutiny." A hint of the boy's rare smile appeared. "Yeah, well, life's been throwing curveballs at me since I was 9. What's one more?" The resilience in that statement, the quiet strength in the face of yet another upheaval, filled Richard with a complex mixture of pride and regret. Pride in the young man Darius had become despite everything, and regret for all the years he hadn't been there to witness that becoming. Saturday evening arrived with a sense of momentous anticipation. Richard stood on the Jackson family's porch, empty-handed as instructed but feeling the weight of expectations nonetheless. He'd changed outfits 3 times before settling on casual slacks and a button-down shirt without a tie, an attempt to look respectful without seeming formal or imposing. Mia opened the door, her critical assessment slightly less hostile than their previous encounter. "You're punctual," she said, as if this surprised her. "Grandma likes that." "Military father," Richard explained with a small smile. "Being late wasn't an option in our house." She led him into a modest living room where framed family photos covered nearly every surface. Richard's gaze was immediately drawn to a large portrait of Shanice with Thomas and the children. Darius couldn't have been more than 8, standing proudly beside his adoptive father, Mia, a small girl at her mother's side, baby Trayvon in Shanice's arms. "That was before Amara was born," Mia explained, following his gaze. "Before Thomas died." Before everything changed for this family, Richard thought. Before these children lost the stability of their parents. Before Darius had to grow up too quickly. Lucille Jackson emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her expression was carefully neutral as she greeted him. "Judge Harmon." "Please call me Richard," he said. "I'm not here as a judge." She nodded once, accepting but not embracing the informality. "Dinner's almost ready. Darius is helping Trayvon with homework. Amara's setting the table." As if summoned by her name, a small girl appeared in the doorway, her resemblance to Shanice so striking that Richard felt his breath catch. She studied him with undisguised curiosity. "Are you really Darius's other dad?" she asked bluntly. "Amara," Lucille scolded gently. "That's not how we talk to guests." "It's all right," Richard assured her. "Yes, Amara. According to the DNA test, I'm Darius's biological father. But Thomas was his real dad," she stated with the certainty of a child repeating a family truth. "Yes," Richard agreed. "Thomas was his dad in all the ways that matter most." His answer seemed to satisfy her. "I'm setting the table. We're having Grandma's special chicken." "That sounds wonderful." Darius appeared with a boy of about 10, Trayvon, Richard presumed, the youngest brother's cautious expression, a miniature version of Darius's guarded demeanor. "You came," Darius said simply. "I said I would." Richard echoed Darius's own words from their earlier conversations. A flicker of recognition passed between them, a small acknowledgement of developing trust. Dinner was initially a stilted affair, with Lucille directing most of the conversation toward safe topics. The upcoming school science fair where Trayvon's project on solar energy would be featured, Mia's debate team competition, Amara's dance recital. Richard listened attentively, genuinely interested in these glimpses into the family's life. Gradually, the conversation turned more personal. Mia, ever direct, asked what many were thinking. "So what happens now, with the DNA test and everything?" Lucille set down her fork. "Mia, perhaps that's not dinner conversation." "It's okay," Richard said. "It's a fair question." He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze settling finally on Darius. Legally, nothing has to change. Darius is 17, almost an adult, but I would like to be part of your lives in whatever way makes sense for all of you. "What does that mean exactly?" Darius asked, his expression guarded but curious. Richard chose his words carefully. "It could mean financial support for college, for all of you. It could mean being available for advice or help when needed. It could mean simply getting to know each other better." He paused. "What it doesn't mean is trying to replace anyone or disrupt the family you already have." Lucille studied him over her glasses. "That's a generous offer, but we've managed on our own for a long time." "I know you have," Richard acknowledged. "And you've done an extraordinary job. These children are a testament to your strength and commitment." He met her gaze directly. "But managing and thriving are different things. I can't change the past 17 years, but I can help make the future a little easier." The conversation might have continued in this vein, but it was interrupted by Richard's phone buzzing insistently in his pocket. He ignored it initially, but when it buzzed a third time in quick succession, he apologized and glanced at the screen. 3 text messages from Margaret. "Turn on the local news now. They're running the story about you and Darius." Channel 5. "It's not good." His expression must have shown his alarm because Darius immediately asked, "What's wrong?" Richard looked up, his throat suddenly dry. "The story, about us, it's on the local news." Lucille quickly found the remote and turned on the small television in the corner of the dining room. Channel 5's evening news was just returning from commercial break, the anchor's serious expression filling the screen. "Our top story tonight. Millfield County Judge Richard Harmon has been placed on administrative leave following revelations that he sentenced his own biological son to juvenile detention earlier this month, apparently without knowing their relationship." The screen showed Richard's official judicial portrait alongside a blurry image of Darius that appeared to have been taken from social media. Sources close to the courthouse confirm that 17-year-old Darius Jackson is the biological son of Judge Harmon from a relationship prior to his marriage. Neither the judge nor his representatives have commented on these allegations, but court records show that charges against the teen were abruptly dropped following Judge Harmon's recusal from the case. Lucille muted the television, her expression thunderous. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. These children have been through enough without becoming some media circus." Richard felt sick. The report hadn't just exposed his connection to Darius. It had implied favoritism in the dismissal of charges, tainting both his professional reputation and Darius's vindication. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I should go. My presence here will only draw more attention." "No," Darius said firmly, surprising everyone. "If you leave now, it looks like we're hiding something, like we did something wrong." He met Richard's gaze. "We didn't do anything wrong." The simple declaration, "we," struck Richard profoundly. For the first time, Darius had included him in a shared perspective. Before anyone could respond, there was a knock at the door. Mia peered through the curtains and gasped. "There's a news van outside, and a reporter with a camera." Lucille stood, her expression resolute. "I'm not having this family harassed in their own home. I'm calling the police." "Wait," Richard said. "Let me talk to them. I'm the one they want." "No," Darius countered. "Let us both talk to them." The suggestion stunned Richard. "Darius, you don't have to do that. You're a minor. You have every right to privacy." "I'm almost 18, Darius replied. "And hiding makes it look like we're ashamed. I'm not ashamed of who my biological father is, even if I'm still figuring out what that means." He looked at his grandmother. "If that's okay with you, Grandma." Lucille studied her grandson with a mixture of concern and pride. "Are you sure, baby? Once this bell is rung, it can't be unrung." Darius nodded. "I'm sure." Richard felt a swell of emotion at the boy's courage. "If we do this, we control the narrative. We state the facts simply and decline to answer intrusive questions." Outside, another car pulled up, Margaret's SUV. Caroline jumped out from the passenger side, rushing to the door ahead of her mother. Mia opened it cautiously, but Caroline's anxious expression must have disarmed her. "Is my dad here? I'm Caroline, his daughter. We saw the news and came right over." "Caroline," Richard called, moving to the door. "You shouldn't have come. There are reporters." "I know," she said, stepping inside with Margaret following. "That's why we came. You shouldn't have to face this alone." Darius appeared behind Richard, his expression curious as he studied Caroline. The resemblance between them was subtle but unmistakable, something in the shape of their eyes, the set of their mouths. "You must be Darius," Caroline said, her voice softening. "I'm so glad to finally meet you." The directness seemed to appeal to Darius, who nodded in acknowledgement. "Yeah, I guess you're my sister." "Half-sister," she corrected with a small smile. "But I've always wanted a brother." The simple acceptance in her voice seemed to ease some of the tension in the room. Margaret hung back, clearly uncomfortable but making the effort to be present. "I'm sorry to intrude on your dinner," she said to Lucille. "But when we saw the news—" "You came to support your family," Lucille finished for her. "I can respect that." Outside, the reporter's knocking grew more insistent. Darius looked at Richard, a new determination in his eyes. "Let's get this over with. Together." Richard felt something shift inside him, a pride that transcended the complicated circumstances, a connection that defied their years of separation. Whatever happened next, they would face it as father and son, not as judge and defendant. He placed a hand on Darius's shoulder, and for the first time the boy didn't pull away. "Together," Richard agreed. As they moved toward the door, Caroline fell into step beside them, her presence a bridge between Richard's two worlds, the family he had built and the family he had unknowingly left behind. The cameras were waiting, hungry for drama and conflict. But what they would capture instead was something far more powerful. The first tentative steps of reconciliation, the beginning of a new kind of justice. The front porch lights illuminated Richard, Darius, and Caroline as they stepped outside to face the reporters. Camera flashes erupted immediately, questions overlapping in an eager cacophony. Richard raised his hand for silence, drawing on years of courtroom authority. "My name is Richard Harmon. I have a brief statement, after which we will not be taking questions." The reporters quieted, recording devices thrust forward. Richard glanced at Darius, who gave him a slight nod. "Last week I discovered that Darius Jackson, who appeared in my courtroom on breaking and entering charges, is my biological son from a relationship before my marriage. I had no knowledge of his existence until that moment. Upon this discovery, I immediately recused myself from his case." Richard paused, choosing his next words carefully. The charges against Darius were dropped not because of our relationship, but because security footage confirmed his account of events. He was innocent, as he maintained from the beginning. A reporter shouted, "Judge Harmon, how could you not know you had a son for 17 years? Darius stepped forward before Richard could respond. My mother, Shanice Jackson, tried to contact him when she learned she was pregnant. The letters never reached him due to a change in address. By the time he returned to Millfield, she had married Thomas Jackson, who adopted me and gave me his name." The simple, dignified explanation, delivered in Darius's steady voice, carried more weight than any defense Richard could have offered. "This is a private family matter," Richard continued. "We are still coming to terms with this discovery and what it means for all of us. We ask that you respect our privacy as we navigate this unexpected chapter in our lives." Caroline moved closer to Darius, a subtle gesture of solidarity. "My brother and his family deserve space and dignity, not intrusion and speculation." Her use of the word brother, unqualified by half or biological, spoke volumes. The reporters noticed it too, their expressions shifting as the narrative transformed before them from scandal to something more nuanced. "Thank you for your time," Richard concluded, guiding Darius and Caroline back inside as reporters shouted follow-up questions that went unanswered. Inside, Lucille nodded with grudging approval. Handled as well as it could be, I suppose. The next morning, the Millfield Gazette's front-page headline read, "Judge discovers son in his courtroom, a story of separation and reconciliation." The article was surprisingly balanced, focusing on the circumstances of their separation rather than implying impropriety in the case dismissal. Richard's straightforward acknowledgement and Darius's dignified presence had diffused much of the scandal's potential, but the professional consequences continued to unfold. 3 days after the news broke, Richard met with Chief Judge Wilson and the Judicial Ethics Committee. The conference room felt cavernous, the faces around the table solemn. "The committee has reviewed the circumstances thoroughly," Wilson began. "We find no evidence of judicial misconduct in your handling of the Jackson case once you became aware of the potential relationship. Your immediate recusal was appropriate." Richard nodded, maintaining his composure. "Thank you." "However," Wilson continued, "the publicity surrounding this case has raised questions about the court's impartiality and procedures. To maintain public confidence in the judiciary, the committee recommends extending your administrative leave for an additional 30 days, after which you would return to civil cases only for a period of 6 months." It was both a punishment and a compromise, acknowledging his prompt recusal while addressing the appearance of impropriety. Richard accepted it without argument, understanding the necessity of preserving the court's reputation. As spring advanced toward summer, new rhythms began to establish themselves. Richard returned to the bench, handling property disputes and contract breaches instead of criminal cases. The initial media frenzy subsided, though occasional articles appeared about the judge and his son, usually framed as a human interest story rather than a scandal. Darius graduated from high school, his family's cheers joined by Richard, Margaret, and Caroline in the audience. The photograph taken afterward, Darius flanked by Lucille on one side and Richard on the other, siblings grouped around them, captured the complex blend of families still finding their way toward a new normal. One warm evening in June, Richard arrived at the Jackson house for what had become a weekly dinner. These gatherings had evolved from formal and tense to something approaching comfortable. Trayvon now eagerly showed Richard his science projects. Amara demanded stories about Caroline's college adventures, and Mia engaged him in increasingly sophisticated debates about legal issues. Darius met him on the porch, a large envelope in his hands. "Got something to show you." Inside was an acceptance letter from Millfield Community College, and a scholarship notification that would cover half his tuition. Richard felt a surge of pride. "That's fantastic, Darius. Computer science, right?" "Yeah, I can do most classes while still working part-time." He hesitated, then added, "But I've been thinking about your offer, about helping with college costs." It was the first time Darius had mentioned Richard's initial offer of financial support. Richard had been careful not to push, understanding the family's pride and Darius's need for independence. "The offer stands," Richard said simply, "for you and your siblings." Darius nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm not asking for a free ride, but if I don't have to work full-time while studying, I could transfer to a 4-year program after 2 years, maybe even state university." "I think that's an excellent plan," Richard said, careful to celebrate Darius's ambition without overwhelming him with enthusiasm. "Whatever you need to make that happen, just let me know." Later, as they all gathered around the dinner table, Richard marveled at how much had changed in just a few months. Amara now sat beside him without hesitation. Trayvon asked him to pass dishes with casual familiarity, and even Lucille had softened, occasionally sharing stories about Shanice that helped Richard piece together the life of the woman he'd barely known. After dinner, Darius invited Richard to the backyard, where he'd set up a small basketball hoop on the garage. They shot baskets in companionable silence for a while, the rhythmic bounce of the ball filling the space where words seemed inadequate. "Caroline said I should visit her at Princeton sometime," Darius mentioned casually. "See what an Ivy League campus is like." "She'd love that," Richard replied, careful not to make too much of this tentative reaching toward family connection. "She's always wanted a sibling close to her age." Darius made a 3-point shot with casual grace. "Must be weird for her, too, finding out she has a brother after all these years." "She's handled it better than anyone," Richard admitted. "No reservations, no complications, just immediate acceptance." "Yeah, she's cool." Darius retrieved the ball, bouncing it thoughtfully. "She doesn't look at me and see all the mistakes and missed years. She just sees her brother." The simple observation contained a profound truth. Caroline had embraced the present possibility rather than dwelling on the past's failures. Perhaps there was wisdom in that approach for all of them. "I keep thinking about that day in your courtroom," Darius said suddenly. "How different everything might be if my lawyer hadn't included that photo of my mom." Richard caught the ball Darius tossed him, holding it as he considered this twist of fate. "I've thought about that too. One small decision changing the course of so many lives." "Do you regret it? Finding out?" "No," Richard said without hesitation. "It's been challenging, painful at times, but no, I don't regret it. Do you?" Darius was quiet for a long moment. "I used to wish I knew who my biological father was. Then after Mom died, I figured it didn't matter anymore." He met Richard's gaze directly. "But now, I think Mom would be glad we found each other. Not to replace Thomas or change the past, but because—" He struggled to articulate the complex emotion. "Because the truth matters," Richard finished for him. "Even when it's complicated." "Yeah," Darius nodded. "The truth matters." They continued shooting baskets as twilight deepened around them, the simple rhythm of the game creating a space where father and son could be together without the weight of expectations or the burden of their complicated history. Inside, the lights of the Jackson home glowed warmly, Lucille's voice calling the younger children for bedtime routines. In the north side of town, Margaret was hosting Caroline's friends for a summer gathering. Two worlds, once separated by geography, circumstance, and choice, now connected by unexpected bonds of blood and developing ties of affection. Richard knew there would be more challenges ahead. The complex integration of families, the ongoing navigation of financial support without overstepping boundaries, the occasional resurgence of media interest, Darius's transition to adulthood with all its inherent complications. But watching his son, and the word felt right now, earned through small moments of connection rather than merely declared by DNA, Richard felt a cautious hope for the future they were building together. Not the fantasy of perfect reconciliation that erased all past wrongs, but something more authentic. A relationship founded on truth, strengthened by mutual respect, and sustained by the choice to move forward together despite the pain of the past. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Darius made one final basket and caught the ball on its way down. "It's getting late," he said. "Grandma will need help with Amara's bedtime story." "I should be going," Richard acknowledged. Darius hesitated, then offered the ball to Richard. "Same time next week?" In that simple question lay all the promise Richard could have hoped for. Not forgiveness exactly, but openness to possibility. A door left ajar rather than closed firmly shut. "I'll be here," Richard promised, and in that moment it felt like the most important commitment he had ever made. More binding than his judicial oath, more meaningful than any ruling he had ever delivered from the bench. For in this quiet backyard, with no robes or gavels to hide behind, no courtroom protocols to guide him, Richard Harmon had finally discovered the true meaning of justice. Not the rigid application of law, but the patient, humble work of making things right, one small moment at a time.